Hi, and welcome to the first webinar on circular business models. To get started with, on the upper right corner, there's a link to Menti that we hope you enter and answer the first question of today. The training today and the next one on 24th of May will introduce you to the fundamentals of circular business models, what the circular economy entails from the business perspective. Therefore, the focus will be on the business value and potential for companies in employing circularity in their operations, so that you can also support your network of companies in their growth and spread awareness of the value of working with inefficiencies that companies might have in their operations, and how the companies can replace these inefficiencies by new circular business models. My name is Hanna Törmänen and I work for Nordic Innovation. We are under the Nordic Council of Ministers, which is the official cooperation body for the 5 Nordic countries. Next slide, please. In 2019, the Nordic Prime Ministers decided on a new joint vision for the Nordic region to be the most sustainable and integrated region in the world by 2030. And this by also working towards a green Nordic region, especially through circular and bio-based economy. So the vision for the circular region is clear, and we have 8 years to deliver. And with circular business models, companies can concretely and step by step contribute to the climate goals and remain competitive and grow at the same time. Next slide, please. These are our teams. The webinars are organized in collaboration with Accenture in the Nordics and Sitra, the Finnish Innovation Fund. And the webinar is based on the Nordic Circular Economy Playbook, a digital toolkit for companies to go circular, which was launched last year and you will soon get a link to. And during this upcoming hour, please raise any questions that you might have, and also what you would need to know more of to support companies in your network in circular transition. Or if you represent a company, what would you need more from your perspective? Now I will hand it over to Katriina.
Thank you, Hanna. We in Accenture are so excited to be hosting this session together with you, and I'm looking forward to taking you through the next hour. The session will be recorded and can be found on Nordic Innovation's website after the sessions. But then to warm up, and if we could move to the next slide and give people an idea of who's participating. If you haven't already, please find your mobile phone and tap into menti.com and enter the code on the screen and answer the first question. And yeah, I see you've already started there, so that's great. And we see we have a broad audience. And let's wait a few more seconds to get everyone on. And yeah, we're a broad group, and I think that just illustrates the wide application of circular economy. And one more question that we want to ask before we kick off is how much you know about circular economy before you started this session today. So we'll give we see things are starting to happen. And some people know it well, and some people are new. And a warm welcome to you all. To move on, I think to make you aware in the next slide, I think if we go one, yeah, perfect. There are 2 learning webinars this spring, the fundamentals, which we're doing right now. And also, if your company is interested, there is a separate course on training the trainer on circular economy, and you'll find more info on that in the chat. Today's course is the first of 2 sessions to provide you the fundamentals of circular economy. The purpose of this session is to give you the basics of circular economy and how this can eliminate linear efficiencies, so to create sustainable growth. And now, on the agenda slide, I would like to introduce Alexander Løberg. He's our industry expert from Accenture, who will take you through why circular economy is important. And after that, Accenture's Nordic sustainability lead, Anna Tøndervold, will explain 6 different circular business models and the circular value these can bring. We will then follow with a Q&A session for both speakers, so please be active and write your questions in the chat along the way, and we'll try to answer as many as possible at the end. And now over to you, Alexander.
Alexander, you are muted. Sorry.
Thank you, Hanna and Katrine, for that introduction, and also introducing me as an expert. I've at least been working in manufacturing and products industries for close to 20 years now. So from a professional level, I see it's becoming more and more relevant. But even from a family and personal level, I realized last night, putting the 8-year-old boy to bed, we ended up talking about circular business models. So it's really all around us. So for the coming minutes, I will focus a bit on why should companies focus on circular business models. And then manufacturing and the wider products industries are resource and carbon intensive, and therefore faced with some of the larger challenges, but also opportunities in this green transition. There are different drivers that push for the transition, and they're often interlinked. So as you see on the slide, we have from the regulator's perspective, the business-to-business customer perspective, and the investors. So from regulators, new circular and sustainability regulations are proposed and really entering at a force at record speed, both with the EU Green Deal and also the EU taxonomy. The scope of regulation is expanding. Regulations are covering the entire value chain, from material design, production process, and also waste handling. So the enforcement starts with the priority industries, including energy, construction, transportation, which is really the focus industries also for this webinar and the sessions going during this spring. From a company's perspective, they're facing increased pressure from buyers' sustainable supply chain targets. We see that there are accelerating requirements for upstream suppliers to report on ESG and to showcase the concrete actions towards circularity and carbon reduction. B2B customers require greener products and services from their value chain partners, and also to meet the customer requirements to keep and strengthen their competitive position. Last is really also from the investor side. We see that investors are more and more adjusting their portfolios towards sustainability, encouraging portfolio companies to develop their ESG reporting and carbon data disclosure. Investors are placing greater emphasis on companies' ESG performance when making investment decisions, and the companies that are acting have priority to access financial resources, which also
I'm sorry, Alexander, I think you got muted again. I don't know why. Thank you.
Okay, so next slide, please. So from a design, production, and the use of products traditionally happen in a straight line. This starts with product design, sourcing, manufacturing, going all the way through logistics, marketing, production, and finally use and end-of-life disposal. We know today that our linear value chain generates so many efficiencies. Hanna mentioned it, Katrine mentioned it, and it generates efficiencies from some key areas. So it's everything from unsustainable materials, how we're not fully utilizing our products. We see that scrapping is done with products too early. not recovering materials or valuable components at disposal, and also maybe most importantly, we fail to engage our customers throughout the value chain. Reducing these inefficiencies make really business sense, and we get also back to that in this session. However, today's methods do not challenge the linear nature of the value chain, which caused these inefficiencies in the first place. This linear process starts with resource consumption in order to turn that into economic value and ultimately economic growth. Circularity disrupts this fundamental assumption. By disconnecting economic growth with resource consumption, circular economy, circular business models proposes new ways of reducing inefficiencies and turning that into business value. There are a huge global opportunity up for grabs by redefining the concept of waste as a valuable resource. To reduce inefficiencies, we need to be aware of them. So on the next slide, we have zoomed in on the different manufacturing industries where we see the largest inefficiencies today. So it's machinery, equipment, maritime, the energy sector, transportation, and construction. We see large inefficiencies occur in the production of machinery and equipment through processes like casting, forging, machining, and welding, which is really energy-intensive processes. Lack of circular design creates inefficiencies during use phase and at the end of life when machines are not operated at optimum performance and components are difficult to operate or recycle. Inefficiencies occur in all parts of the maritime value chain. And we see that underutilized capacity is really the largest waste pool. Vessels often have long idle times or are not operated at full capacity, creating unnecessary cost and emissions. Other efficiencies could be wasted end of life value and use of recycled material in new vessels, as well as unexploited customer engagement. For instance, how manufacturers can establish platforms to strengthen customer relation and also the collaboration from a customer perspective. But in energy, we see unsustainable materials to produce electrical components and products and wasted end-of-life value as the biggest inefficiencies for this sector. Electrical equipment is often produced with an aim to be energy efficient, but not necessarily focused on durability, repairability, or recycling. In transportation, inefficiencies often occurs across the transportation value chain, especially in the design and end-of-life phase. Few vehicles or trucks or overall mobility assets are designed for assembly, recycling, repair, and recovery are often challenging in terms of these assets. Industry drivers also we see pressure in terms of moving away from fossil sources. At the same time, new battery regulations are emerging, and B2Bs are driving for sustainable handling and end-of-life products, which we see more and more. Last but not the least, construction. Wasted end-of-life value is the largest inefficiency in the construction industry. Waste from the construction sector accounts for more than 30 to 40% of the total waste generated in the Nordics. There's a huge waste sector. Buildings are built for long lifetime without ease of assembly or flexible use, and take-back schemes from manufacturers of components at end of life is rare and still very limited. Later in this webinar, you will hear from Anna how we can use circular principles to turn these inefficiencies into business value and growth. If you look at this slide, addressing current waste in 4 dimensions of linear value chain, significantly value pools to be unlocked. Accenture has estimated this opportunity to be more than $4.5 trillion globally in 2030, which can be translated to approximately 100 billion euros in the Nordics. To Hanna's point, we see a positive development and huge possibilities in the Nordics, but still there's a large circularity gap in the Nordics. In terms of then the wasted capacity and resources, by introducing renewable energy, fully recyclable and bio-based fuels, chemicals, and materials, as well as utilizing durable and modular design, we can substitute wasted resources in the supply chain. We can monetize wasted capacity by increasing sharing, co-owning, co-using, and resource pooling. We can monetize wasted capacity. We can lengthen the vested life cycles by offering our product as a service or offering new services for resell, maintain, repair, remanufacture, or products, and growing it into used market sales where we can lengthen currently wasted life cycles. And then it's also on the recover wasted embedded values. We can recover wasted embedded materials values by increasing recycling, upcycling, component reuse, and energy recovery. So circular economy and business principles have been around for centuries, but it's not until recently that we really see that circular business models have gained increased traction as they're being powered by rapid technology and the increased focus on what really drives customer outcomes. So I'll hand it back to you, Katrine. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexander. And I think one of the important messages that I take away from here is that it's not just about sustainability and cutting emissions when going circular, but it can also release significant value. So thank you for illustrating that for us. And I think that's a good bridge over to our next speaker, Anna Tøndervold. She's, again, Accenture's Nordic Sustainability Lead, and she will go into a bit more specifics on the circular business models and how these can release business value. So warm welcome, and over to you, Anna.
Thank you, Katrine, for that introduction, and thank you, Alexander, for a good segue here into introducing the circular business models. So, as Alexander was saying, there are a lot of inefficiencies, and by addressing those, you can achieve untapped value potential. So what my ambition is to do now in the latter part of this section is to help you understand how those untapped value potentials and how those inefficiencies can be addressed. So I will introduce you to the concept of circular business models. So first of all, the circular economy and the principles of the circular economy can really be applied to the entire value chain. There are many circular principles, but to simplify, we at Accenture have developed a framework of categorizing the major models into 5 key categories. And I will take you through each one of these now. So starting from the beginning of the value chain, in the way that we source and the way that we produce products, assets, how can we apply circular business models? By reusing or introducing materials that can be reused over and over and over again. That's why this start of the value chain is so important, because it really sets the fundamentals for enabling circular economy also at the latter parts of the value chain. So looking into this design and the sourcing process, first of all, it's important that we use materials that are reusable. That goes for indirect material as well as direct materials. So for example, using renewable electricity in our production systems, but also using materials in the way that we design our products by using materials that are biodegradable or simply can be recycled at the end of life. But on top of this, not just thinking about the materials that goes into the products, but also how do we design the products? Thinking about how we can use modular design principles and also what we call build to last. Because by applying these design principles, companies can ensure that when parts of a product breaks, they can easily be replaced. And that also enables the circular economy. So again, emphasizing really how important it is to set the fundamentals right when you design a product. Then if we move ahead in the value chain and we start thinking about the use phase. So as Alexander was mentioning, currently we have underutilized capacities. And if we think about that in another way, it means that we produce more than what we actually need. We're not using assets to their fullest capacity. So how can we rethink really the use phase? And here, one of the first concepts is a sharing economy, a sharing platform, where instead of owning an asset, we can provide a sharing platform where multiple users can come together and therefore share capacity and share use, and hence also then reducing the number of assets that is needed on the market. So I think that's also why this is a very interesting model. because it fundamentally reduces the number of products and material that we need to consume. Furthermore, in the use phase of assets and products, the third model that I want to introduce you to is in product use extension. So product use extension is really about thinking, how can we maximize the use of the product and the assets that we bring to market, not disposing them too early because of parts that are breaking, parts that are becoming redundant, or simply because parts become outdated. They're more modern technologies, etc. So here, how can we extend the life by applying principles such as repair, resell, remanufacturing, upgrading, maintaining? I think in the manufacturing industry, we see a lot of these examples on how we also apply intelligence and analytics to also have preventive maintenance, to avoid also that products break and therefore also minimizing the utilization rate. So these concepts are also fundamental to really maximize the use and reduce the need for introducing new products into the life cycle. Eventually, products will come to an end of life when there's no more value in that life cycle. And here we should think about the value and the embedded value in the materials that exist within the product and how we can recapture that. Can we upgrade the material to new life cycles, or can we recycle and reuse it again into our own production system? So although the product reaches its end of life, there is still value in the embedded material in the product, and this we really need to capture. Then the fifth business models that I will introduce is product as a service. So this model really encompasses the full value chain and introduces a concept of, instead of owning an asset, we can rent and lease and provide assets as a service. What's really interesting with this business models is that it shifts the ownership to the producer. And by doing so, the producer has the incentives to maximize the use. So the producer is responsible to ensure that the product gets used in services, which will also enable the producers to have incremental sales and revenues through these sales and leasing services. So I think this is also an interesting concept for that purpose, but it also shifts incentives for the producer to make sure that all the other circular business models are applied, because that will help obtain value for the producer by extending the product product use extension and by having resource recovery. Those values are being kept back with the producer, and hence why and incentivize the producer to incorporate more circular principles. So those are the fundamental 5 circular business models that companies should consider. And if we go to the next slide, this is to demonstrate that the 5 circular business models are a simplified view of reality. And in fact, there are sub-models that can be applied and considered. So as you explore the circular economy, it's important that you also further investigate in these circular business models and understand really what aspects of the circular model is relevant for your company and for your industry. What I also like about this illustration here with the sub-models is the focus, where we can see that actually the majority of the circular business models really circulates around the use phase. And this is because that's where the most inefficiencies apply. So how can we really reconsider the use phase, and how can we make sure that we circulate over and over again to make sure that we maximize the assets and the products that we put to market? Next slide, please. So as Alexander was describing, depending on your industry and depending on your operating models and your assets, the different inefficiencies and the different circular opportunities varies. And I think this is important. And I think this is also why we're introducing this program to help explore what models can be relevant for your business. So as we see different inefficiencies, for example, in the machinery and equipment sector, where a lot of the inefficiencies happens during the use phase. A lot of the most interesting circular business models, the big bets within this industry, is really how to rethink and extend the product life cycles by applying build to last concepts, by applying also maintenance and repair services and sharing platforms. On the contrary, if we look at the construction business, a lot of the inefficiencies, as Alexander was mentioning, is actually happening due to the material use and the waste that occurs in the construction company. So how can we avoid this by, from the start, applying circular supplies, but also recovering and recycling at the end of life? So this is just to illustrate that different industries have different opportunities and different challenges, and hence it's important to understand what's most relevant for you. So that's an introduction to the circular business models on a conceptual, quite high level. Now let's also look into the value potential of circular economy. So when looking at value potential, typically we look at it very short term. But when we address circular economy and sustainability overall, we need to think about the long-term perspective as well. And that's what this matrix introduces. So looking at the increase in positives and also the reduction in negatives. In the short term and in what we typically look in the traditional value case assessment, there's of course the general principles that the circular economy in the short term can increase sales by increasing premiums or basically just increasing revenues. But what's also interesting with the circular economy is that, as I was mentioning, this can open up for new service models and new market access by being more relevant to the customer and providing differentiated type of products, or expand your product portfolio. So in the short term, there is a lot of revenues that can be generated, but there's also cost savings. And I think this really, the notion of cost saving really applies to the fundamental principles of the circular economy. How can we do more with less? How can we improve efficiency? And from a cost saving perspective, obviously, when we reduce the number of resources that we use, or when we are smarter about the utilization, here we can achieve a lot of resource reduction, but also energy costs or costs related to CO2 emissions, but also labor productivity or production cost savings. So that's the short-term perspective. But also, if we think about circular economy in the long term, it's really about helping brands improve their image, their branding, both to employees, but as well as to customers, to be more attractive. As Alexander was mentioning in the beginning, there is some increasing requirements from stakeholders, requiring companies to take their responsibility, understanding the challenges that we're facing in climate change. So engaging in the circular economy can also enhance the brand and therefore customer loyalty, and ensuring that you can actually have access to your customers. But as we're also seeing, a lot of investments are now being driven to those companies that have improved ESG performance. So there's multiple dimensions of brand enhancements. And the last component of this value matrix that I want to mention is around risk reduction. So we see that markets are affected by our resource consumption and by the effects that we're causing to the environment. So examples of risk that we're seeing is just volatility in, for example, resource prices. So here's just another one example of, by engaging in a circular economy, you're not as exposed to those price volatilities. But there's also reputational risk or even regulatory risk considerations. For examples, as we see that regulations is increasing, and therefore also tax and fees that can apply to companies that are not engaging in the circular economy. So I think that we should see the circular economy from this both short and long-term perspective. And what I really like about the circular economy is that it makes business sense. We're doing more with less. We're being better in our footprint to the environment, and hence creating and opening up those new value potentials. And if we move to the next slide, just introducing the concept of value migration and value addition. So I think what we should recognize now with the circular economy principles being widely applied across industries. Now, circular economy is better known, and we're seeing an increasing amount of companies that are engaging in the circular economy. Hence, we're seeing how revenues and value pools are shifting within industries. Either you tap into the value potential and achieving value addition, or we can see that companies will experience value migration to companies that have approached the circular economy and therefore can increase their relevance to their companies or increasing their relevance to their customer by the fact that they have a more enhanced brand value and this environmentally conscious branding that attracts companies and customers. And then the value addition, as mentioned, here goes with the principles that I just introduced, by increasing revenues and reducing costs. So let's look at the different circular business models, and let's look at some examples on how these different business models can generate value. So again, starting with the start of the value chain and looking into circular inputs. By building to last, we can reduce production costs by using less variety in our components and by applying modular design principles. A great example is Wärtsilä, who's achieved 45% reduction in their production cost by using modular design principles. But also it makes sense to use circular supplies. We're seeing that there is an increasing market for recycled components, and using recycled materials can then also reduce cost compared to virgin material. If we think about sharing platform, instead of owning an asset, here you can only pay for what you actually need. So from a sharing platform perspective, there's a cost efficiency for those who engage in that. And there are many companies that are now providing shared platform services. For example, we see a company named Flexe who's offering warehouse space to companies by providing that as a service, and therefore companies can optimize their uses rather than owning the warehousing space themselves. And if we continue, I think just adding some examples from a product extension perspective. Obviously, if we can extend our product life cycles and product use extension, this can reduce the cost for purchasing new, but also it can prevent downtime and hence increase productivity and cost related to that. I will just also refer back to the playbook and the tools that are available online, and they provide a really good assets for where you can also explore the different business models and the submodels and the revenue and the value potentials associated with those to explore further. And with that, I think I will hand over to Katarina again.
Thank you very much, Anna, for introducing us to these business models. And hopefully some of the listeners have gotten some ideas of what could be applicable for their industry and what value it could create for them. And now I think before we move over to a Q&A session for the speakers, we will start with asking you 2 questions. So if you could find your mobile phone again and tap into Menti, we would start with the first question of the Q&A session. And based on what you heard from Alexander, we thought it would be valuable for the group to share what they believe are the drivers for the transition. And maybe we could get Alexander on the screen, and kind of as we see people start to answer, kind of why are the different drivers for different industries. And Alexander, what do you think is most important, and also how you see the graph developing now that we're getting our first answers? We'll probably give it a couple of seconds. I see that now most of you are saying regulators, customer demands, and employees.
Yeah, I think this resonates very well, Katrine, and also maybe Hanna want to also add something here based on the earlier programs. But of course, regulations are making a push. But if you look at also the drivers and who is succeeding is really on the customer side. So really, the companies that are focused on what drives customer and partner outcomes, how to collaborate, how to think ecosystems, and then this really is coming back to the customer and the consumer demands, Katrine. But yeah, Hanna, maybe you also want to point out something from earlier programs. I think this is quite representative in terms of what we have seen earlier, but definitely regulations are really important. But if you look at who's really then succeeding, it's down to the consumers, collaboration, Katrina.
Yes, what we also have heard from the companies from the earlier workshops has been that it is the customers that can also set also targets for sustainability, and then the circular business models are a way to contribute to those. So absolutely, this looks like a good overview and what we have also thinking. And you mentioned the regulations, many of you, that there's still a lot to work on at the Nordic level as well, and that we could perhaps also test in trying to take away some of them at the Nordic level, and so that. But you can also write in the chat if you have any input. What do you see as most relevant or the biggest barriers, basically, you see for the regulation side?
And Anna, maybe you also want to comment here, because we are only one thinks it's investors, and why do you think customer demands and regulators are so, people are feeling that they're the largest drivers?
I think it's interesting, as you said as well, that we only see that one participant voted here that the investor pressure are the biggest driver, and maybe it's due to the fact of having to prioritize these different considerations, where obviously regulatory pressure is something that you cannot avoid, and customer demand will more short-term impact your revenue potentials and your competitive position. So I guess in terms of a priority, I can understand these, and I think that what we're right now facing is just a significant increase in regulations in this space, and there's still a lot of uncertainties on how to respond to these new regulations. So I can see that the number of questions that we're getting from companies at the moment, us as advisors at least, I can see that there's a lot of questions coming due to the fact that there are increased regulations and how to interpret those, and how to become more resilient. But to the point on investors, and I think Alexander mentioned that before as well, investors are really looking into ESG factors now, where resource use is one of the major ones in the E of the ESG. So I think that perhaps not as clearly now differentiated in the overall ESG assessment. And I think also the link between circular economy and the carbon aspects needs to be better understood. And I would expect that the investor pressure would increase as a result, as that knowledge also increase.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Just a comment, Katrina. I think maybe one of the early questions that came in also can be a bit tied to this in terms of the small medium enterprises versus the largest ones, and I think maybe also touch into it a bit later on the Menti, Katrina, but what we've also seen in the earlier programs with the different companies and organizations involved, of course, making the necessary changes as a small medium company could be easier in terms of incorporating in your strategy, in your operating model, how you're engaging with your customers and how you're collaborating in the ecosystem. It could be a bit more challenging in a larger enterprise to get that change. But of course, Anna also mentioned some success stories, for instance, in Wärtsilä, which is of course a large Nordic enterprise. But maybe you also want to add something on that, Anna, in terms of the small mediums versus the large enterprises.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that your comment there on the differences between large enterprises and then small to medium enterprises, of course, there are different impacts and also better resilience. I think as a small to medium enterprise, your ability to respond to regulatory pressures and customer demands becomes even more crucial, and you're not extended to the same factors as larger peers.
Thank you. I think we'll move over to our next Menti, and before we go into continue to the Q&A, and a second question that we first want the audience input is that what is your motivation to transition to circular business models? So why kind of builds on the drivers, but goes a bit different as well. So why do you think it's valuable for your company or the companies that you're working with? And Anna, maybe I can lift you up on the screen here as well to get you to start commenting as we see the graph develops and what people answer, and then we can, and then more people can jump in if we have more inputs.
So this proves that I was wrong, that the connection between circular economy and emissions was not widely understood. So I'm really glad to see that the companies really see the circular economy, and reducing our resource consumption has a big impact, obviously, on our emissions. As much as almost 50% of our emissions is related to overconsumption. So I'm really glad to see that is one of the highest bars. But also we're seeing here revenue generations and that optimistic opportunity with circular economy is also great to see, really as a competitive and differentiating factor. We're seeing how many companies are trying to differentiate their offerings with circular economy principles and really staying relevant to customers. Maybe that goes back to that we saw a large share of the participants voting that customer demand was really one of the major drivers. Surprised not to see much more on the cost savings. Maybe that is implicit that reducing your resource consumptions will also drive improved efficiency in terms of cost and productivity. And I think this is why also the circular economy is I think the more you explore it, you start realizing that many of the business models are actually not new concepts. They are concepts that have been around for ages, extending product life by maintenance and repair, by recovering material. Those things are concepts that companies obviously in the past have been explored just from the pure cost perspective. All right, so now influence this vote, and cost has now risen. So maybe I shouldn't explain too many of the drivers here to influence the voting.
Yeah, but I really think it shows that there are different drivers, and here also you can just choose one. So kind of there are several motivations, of course, but interesting to see what's the number one that triggers you when you first see this question. And I see we got a lot of questions in the chat. Some are shorter and some are longer, and I'll try to summarize some of the longer one first, and then we'll just go through. And please, if you have more questions, feel free to pop them in the chat. And I think the first one goes to you, Anna. It's a long question from Mia, and they're trying to get their so they're working with different suppliers, and they can and they're trying to see how can I argue for the recycled material when laws in some countries does not allow it. So they want to have recycled material in their products, but kind of being a global company makes it difficult with different laws in different countries, if I summarize that correctly. And what are your comments to that, Anna?
I think it's a fair comment, and I think that some of the barriers to the circular economy still needs to be addressed. As you were pointing out here, there are still regulatory barriers with differences, even within the EU, in terms of trading waste and using recycled material. So I think typically when we speak to companies about applying recycled material strategies or increasing the use of recycled materials, we typically do a bit of a product segmentation and trying to explore where are the most logical areas to start first. But I think regulations will eventually mature. So starting with some selected products is a good way at least to start. And also it might require some different market segmentations and approaches. So it is a fact that regulations are still a little bit behind, but hoping that these things will be addressed in the future. So being proactive in the ways that we can.
Mm. Yeah. And a different question, I can't see the author, but how can you create incentives for more companies in your value chain to start the transition? And that kind of, it all builds together on the last question as well. That would have helped Mia. I'm not sure, Alexander, if you want to answer this or if I should give the word to Anna. Please feel free to raise your hand.
I think it's quite tied to what also Anna mentioned, so maybe you want to further elaborate, Anna, on it.
Sure, can you just shortly repeat the question again?
Yeah, so kind of creating incentives, kind of building on what you said now, that how can we get the whole value chain to become circular, not just like stopping one place, one company that want to go circular, and then it meets these hinders. So what more incentives are there? And I can also add a question that I see further down, kind of how to motivate. Where should that change be? Should it be on the CEO role, or where should it start in the company as well? I'm now trying to combine two questions for you.
I think this question is super relevant because we obviously need collaborations and ecosystems to join forces in order for the circular economy to work. There's the chain is only as strong as its weakest link. And I think this maybe also goes back to what I said previously, that by setting the fundamentals in the start, you will also enable circularity across the various parts of the value chain. So emphasizing, yes, on the importance that this ecosystem collaboration is required. I think if we start thinking about the reasons why we're seeing that it's difficult to get the ecosystem collaboration to work, some of the things that we're seeing is that we need to increase data transparency for companies to better open up and share and contribute to each other's circular performance. Sharing material data, having traceability and transparency across the value chain can help those collaboration models to understand how you can best contribute. But also understanding how the shared value can be divided between companies is also a question, and this, I guess, risk of sharing competitive information to your peers. So I think what we need to do in order to open up for circular economy is engaging in those platforms and joining the discussions together. This should obviously be led by the C-level of a business to really encourage those type of collaboration and have that as a strategic priority rather seeing it as a risk. But I think that
something to add to that, and also what I've seen in earlier programs. Of course, the C-level involvement is really important, but we also have seen companies involved in earlier programs working together for several years and not really being aware of their different, let's call it, waste pools on each side of the companies, and how something on one side can drive the waste on someone else. So the collaboration is essential also on all levels of organizations, and then again on the collaboration ecosystem working together. But it's definitely important on the C-level, but it's really also the way of how companies are collaborating, what kind of data they're sharing, but also what kind of understanding they have of each other's processes and way of working, which could be, again, focused on the end consumer demands, generate, for instance, inefficient behavior on certain parts of the value chain, Trine.
Yeah, and kind of going to the other end of kind of a large company and what they should do. So what are your advice? There's a question from Alisa. So from where do you recommend startups to start with their limited time and capital and resources? So this is completely different again than kind of flipping what you said almost. So what are your comments to that?
I think it's, for me, ties back to some of the earlier things that we have touched today on making sure to really incorporate it early in your operating model, in your strategy, to make it as integrated part of your company. And starting up as a new company, then it's easier to do that. And of course, we also have seen in earlier programs startups participating in this program, and it's definitely important to have this in mind. And it's back also to the drivers, because starting up as a new company, you can really make it more clear in terms of how you're very much focused on what your customers' needs are, Katrina. But yeah, maybe Anna wants to elaborate on also how we have seen this for other startups.
To me, there are maybe two aspects to mention here, because I think as a startup, and I think you mentioned it, Alexander, as well, the benefit of being small and nimble is sometimes that you don't need to change a big legacy organization and really drive that change, because that also gets me to the point that also Alexander mentioned, but maybe I just want to elaborate on because I think it's so fundamental. We shouldn't see the circular economy as something separate to the way that we operate as usual. Typically, what we advise companies is that rather than having circular economy or even sustainability as as a standalone or separate organization. We encourage them to incorporate these principles across the entire business. So circular economy is not something that happens in silos. Circular economy is something that happens in the sourcing department, just how we source and what type of materials that we source and what type of requirements that we put on our suppliers. It happens in the sales organization, in the way that we engage with our customers, and really, rather than having a one-off sale, really think about how you can extend that customer relationship and offer services and taking responsibility for the product that you've sold. And it goes on across the other parts of the business. So I think don't necessarily see circular economy as something separate. Start thinking about how you can infuse circular principles into every part of your business. So that's one aspect. And then I think what extra sort of emphasis that can help accelerate the circular economy is sometimes by finding a pilot and really starting small. It doesn't need to be advanced, and then infusing that pilot in the different parts of the organization.
Thank you very much, Anna. And I saw a question now just coming into the chat, and I think we can almost use that as a cliffhanger to the new session as well. And that, what would you see as the challenges for the circular transition? And that's actually a perfect question that will kind of leave there hanging. And you've already touched upon it, of course, but that brings us over to the next steps and what we will discuss in the next fundamentals, which is on the 24th, so 2 short weeks. So then we will cover the capabilities and technologies that are needed in circular transformations and what barriers there are typically. So that kind of you will get that answered then. And we'll also look through the questions that we haven't answered and kind of bring them up in the next session as well. And if you haven't got the link already, you should when you've signed up here. But else use the same registration link or contact us. And yeah, I think I'll round this session off with saying thank you for today, and thank you so much to our speakers and our collaboration partner Nordic Innovation, and for your participation. So see you next time on the 24th. Bye.